hopefully you've seen a bit of our passion here about giving you information. And I always say with our speaker training, even if you're not feeling well, never get up there and say, listen, folks, I'm going to give this, but I'm not feeling well tonight, or say anything negative about your talk, because you just create terrible expectations. So let me just say to you tonight, I don't want to give this talk. Why? Well, I don't want to lead us astray and down a path of negativity and distrust and civil disobedience or something like that. But when we go out on ministry, increasingly all our speakers will tell you when we have a Q&A time, climate change comes up. What's your position on climate change? And diligently for many, many years, and this is not new, for many years we've said we're kind of sitting on the fence at the moment till there's more data, till there's something we can deal with. And we said before, the test of any hypothesis is, can it be proven false? Well, we have enough data now to test the claims of, the climate change advocates, etc. So that's what we're going to do tonight. And the other reason I don't want this talk is I really like nice pictures, and I get to follow Spike with a very technical, data-driven talk with a bunch of stats and figures, and I'll be watching you if you fall asleep, all right? But let me say this. I want to protect this planet. You know why? It's God's. We have been given dominion over it. We have been given stewardship over it. But God's planet was given for mankind. And we should thank him for that and treat it with the respect that it deserves, being his. The great problem you're going to see with the climate change movement is it has its roots in evolution. Go figure. What you believe about where you came from, remember, will determine your worldview. And so as we go through this, you're going to see that what we think of as nefarious, sinister agendas, please don't think that, because I don't want to lead you down that path. It is people with a wrong worldview, causing them to interpret data, sometimes falsely give us data, because guess what? They want you to believe what they believe. Don't we deal with that with the evolution and creation issue? Same thing. They believe in evolution because that's all they've ever been taught, and they think that the opposing view is kind of crazy. So scientifically, this is very complex, and I'll tell you, it's taken me a lot to wrap my head around. And the information I'm going to give to you, I need to publicly say, primarily as a result of the research of my friend in Australia. We went to the same church. In fact, Dr. Don Batten, who's just resigned as general manager / CEO, when I say resigned, retired. He's still working, overseeing Creation Magazine, etc. And because as a ministry, I keep telling you, we have these checks and balances. And so he worked on the data. It was presented to the CEOs at our international meeting of our offices, and we decided that we will take a position and a stand on this, just as I mentioned during the question time on another controversial issue, because the data and the science leads us in that conclusion. And as a ministry, people generally trust us. They seek our opinion on a lot of things. So as much as I don't want to, I'm going to give you what I believe is the truth. But the first thing with all things, I said the other night, let's not just go down rabbit holes and get angry. I do not want to lead others to anger. We should never do that. Okay? Even as Christians, we need to be sober-minded. So we need to think about some biblical worldview principles. Everything was created through and for Jesus Christ. Colossians 1. Remember, the universe was created to bring forth a bride for Christ. And what we should remember is he sustains, he upholds all things by his word. God is in charge of this universe. Whatever happens to it's not going to take him by surprise, is it? The earth was created for mankind. We spoke about our dominion mandate. That's the term we like to use. Go and fill the earth. The old Bible says go and subdue the earth, etc. So the earth was designed to be filled by humans and for humans. We are to worship the Creator. Here's where it goes wrong, doesn't it? Not the creation. Okay? And as Christians, we affirm, as a ministry, we have a responsibility to look after the environment because it shows good stewardship of what God has given us. And you'll also see, when I'm trying to get us back on track to the greatest commandment, okay, a lot of Jesus' ministry was about healing the sick, feeding the hungry, etc., looking after those who are less fortunate. Americans, my fellow Americans, hey, I can say that now. We are the wealthiest country in the world. We have been sincerely blessed. Let us not take that for granted. And again, look at who is your neighbor. So we are going to look at some of these things. We're going to look at the real history of the world from the Bible. I beg pardon. Is climate change just a matter of science? That's why I said this is going to be technical talk. How scientific is climate science? And we'll look at other concerns that we should guide us in our Christian approach. So here we go. First off, we affirm the biblical time frame. Now, we tend to call ourselves young earth creationists. If you follow our ministry, I call for a bit of a revolution in the way we address ourselves. We are biblical creationists. Because guess what? The default position, unfortunately, is an old earth, and when we call ourselves young earth, we kind of polarize our own position. We believe what the Bible clearly teaches. We are biblical creationists. I'd love you to start using that term. Okay, as I said, people were commanded to fill the earth. God created the earth to be productive. It's incredible. You know, Spike will tell you, no matter where we look, we cannot find something suitable elsewhere for humans to live out there in the solar system or wherever we look, as far as we can look. We also have to recognize, and so many Christians forget this, okay? We live in a fallen world. We live in a fallen world. That's why we are overtaken by diseases, deaths, cancers. It's why we get tsunamis. It's why we get earthquakes. It wasn't just humans that was cursed. The ground was cursed. The plants was cursed. You and I, folks, even as beautiful as it is, we live in a fallen creation. But having said that, we have a biblical basis for our confidence that the climate is designed to be broadly stable. I would say to you that the climate, the earth, has many self-correcting mechanisms, right? As long as we don't tip it over the edge, and I don't think we're in any danger of that. After the flood, God promised, didn't he? While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Contra to what we call misanthropy, which is actually a hatred of mankind. A hatred of mankind. Do fellow human beings hate their species? Well, we might say that, but let me ask you, who really hates people? Yeah. Jesus also said he is the ruler of this world. He is a liar, the father of lies. There is some truth in him. Oh, good, you're listening. There is no truth in him. If the devil's a liar, okay, he shouldn't be trusted. And I'm not saying that all of this is some satanic agenda, but I have to say, when you see my conclusion, you'll think about the destruction of people's worldview. So as we go on, humans were created to care for and rule over the earth and everything in it, that dominion mandate. Now that's contra to the deep time view. The deep time view, billions and millions of years, says the earth existed for those time frames and was actually doing pretty okay until humans entered the scene. Until we evolved and we apparently messed things up. Now I'm going to make a bit of focus of my talk tonight, facts and figures from Australia. We in Australia, we have a pretty fragile ecosystem. We have lots of really, really neat, unique animals. And by and large, we've been able to keep really bad diseases like foot and mouth, anthrax, all those types of things out of the country. If you go to Australia, the customs, they won't even allow you to take sealed packaged meat, food. Nope, has to go out. I came back from a missions trip in Papua New Guinea, and my team, they had these little wooden bow and arrows, and they stuck them in a big plastic bag, sealed it, or before they sealed it, they sprayed it full of insecticide, sealed the bag, and said, don't open that for a week. So, yeah, we have a very, very fragile ecology, lots of neat animals. But Australia has become like the centre for climate change activists as a result. And we have extremes of weather, famines, of drought, floods, fire. We always seem to have the extremes down there as well. So that's always got their attention. But, in Australia and California, you may have seen there were some very, very bad bushfires in 2019. And it was due to the lack of fuel reduction, right? Burning off. My hometown of Perth, just north, there was a national park called Yanchep, one of the most visited national parks in the country. You could go walking on the trails and you could see all the leaf litter and everything else. And guess what? It eventually caught fire. And it was like a lunar landscape. And I'm not exaggerating, literally nothing was left because the heat was so great due to the lack of fuel reduction. It basically destroyed everything. And we know that Australian Aboriginals, our Indigenous people, tend to be very nomadic before white settlers came. They were doing this themselves because they realized if they kept the fuel down and they kept the forest alive, animals will inhabit the forest because there was food for them and then there was food for Aboriginals. So they were managing their environment very, very well. And so national parks today, many of them have suffered this fate. But the deep time view I'm going to talk about is the Ice Age, or what evolutionists believe are multiple ice ages occurring, every few 100,000 years and so on. And this is based on something called the Milankovitch mechanism. And so what happens is they say the Earth gets into a slight wobble and it affects the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. Okay, it warms certain parts, and then we ended up getting an ice age because of increased evaporation and so on and so forth. And this is why they're really keenly looking at carbon dioxide production by humans, because they believe that carbon dioxide could cause the Earth to warm, and possibly also that could lead us to an ice age. This is why CO2 is so important to them. They believe a little change in this greenhouse gas should be able to do the same thing as their alleged Milankovitch cycles over many hundreds of thousands of years. Do we actually know whether there were these cycles over hundreds of thousands of years? No. Of course, we believe the one and only ice age came within a few hundred years after the global flood. I mentioned before about the fact that the flood is the greatest, or the great engine we need to generate an ice age. The flood was about 4,500 years ago. This is the greatest climate change event in the history of the world. And here we are 4,500 years later, and look at our planet. Recovered pretty well, didn't it? Oh, and then, as I said, a few hundred years after this, we had the first ice age. And just to repeat, warm oceans, undersea landslides, lots of tectonic activity, slightly warming the oceans, increasing evaporation. All that moisture in the atmosphere is going to fall on the Earth, but due to the volcanic dust blocking out the sunlight, it now falls as snow and sleet and builds up ice bridges. Now, people often think the whole Earth was covered in ice. It's not like that. It was actually mainly the northern latitudes here in the United States, probably wouldn't have even reached as far as, our southern borders, etc. And of course, with the new continents that pulled apart at the time of the flood, we've got exposed land bridges because of lower ocean levels, ice bridges across continents. And so when I often get asked about the question, how did animals get to Australia from the Ark in the Middle East? The simple answer is that they hopped there. Okay? Because when you look at these particular areas, okay, the water levels are actually not that deep. You've got the Bering Strait here, etc. So not very, very hard for animals to migrate. So our view of history is very different. We don't believe there are multiple ice ages, and that's what drives their view. And I repeat that one there with Psalm 104, verse 8. The mountains rose. Watch evolution's Achilles heels. You'll see mountain ranges with folded and bent rock. Well, if that mountain range is pushed up a couple of centimeters a year, why aren't all those layers cracked? Why are they folded and bent? Because they were pushed up quickly while the material was soft, etc. The Bible records in many places weather events that God ordained. God made these events as judgments or blessings on people. Jesus calmed the seas and the storm with his spoken word. How can he do that? Because he's the creator and it's under his control. Okay, the weather is under God's control. We look at Joseph's 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine in Egypt. Under the Mosaic law, Israel's idolatry invited crop failure and so on. As I said at the beginning, our worldview will impact our attitude. And what I'm going to show you is the extreme end, all right, of the climate change movement. And you've probably heard of Extinction Rebellion. It's called XR. You've heard that name in the news, but do you really know what it means? Well, here's one of their advocates here. This lady is called Professor McCormack of Cambridge University in England. She's a neo-goth. She actually dresses this way while delivering her lectures, how to impress her students, right? In her recent book, An A-Human Manifesto, that means a world without humans, she advocates not just for the reduction in human population around the world, but the total removal of humans from the planet. Banning and phasing out human reproduction. In fact, it's a common view of deep time beliefs and those that hold it in the climate change movement. Okay, humans are a recent plague upon the earth. It was fine for millions of years. She says the earth will restore stability once humans are gone. I notice she's not first in line to practice out her belief system, right? Is climate change just a matter of science? Well, again, let's look at this. The German economist and IPCC, for those who've been following this, you'll know who they are, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're the ones that actually advise governments about the world, around the world, about climate change. An international body advising our governments, look what they have said. One must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. I thought this was about the environment. Obviously, the owners of coal and oil will not be enthusiastic about this, but one has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore, with problems such as deforestation and the ozone hole, said back in 2010. That's a panel, and you're going to see some of their data later that advises our governments. What's happening here? Here's the founder of the Extinction Rebellion movement. The shortcut for them is XR. Their founder, Stuart Basden. Here's what he says. He, by the way, claims to be a medium and a spiritualist, and he uses a lot of neo-Marxist language, talks about patriarchy, white supremacy, class hierarchy, etc. And he says XR is about fixing the system. I wonder what he means by that. I think it's destroying Western society, actually. So here's what he says. I'm here to say that XR isn't about the climate. You see, the climate's breakdown is the symptom of a toxic system that has infected the ways we relate to each other as humans and to all life. Furthermore, there's an inconsistency between the talk guys, because they don't do much walk the walking. If their concern was truly about saving the planet, I suggest to you there's much more serious problems than carbon dioxide, and I'm going to show you that. It's their main target, of course. Why? Because wealthy industrial nations generally produce more carbon dioxide than poor nations, right? And so when you want to redistribute wealth, sounds like a Marxist policy to me, I have to say that, you target the wealthy countries. See, I tell you, there is a problem with microplastics in the ocean. There really is. We should be doing something about that. That's a problem. No one likes to see oil spills that mess up our beaches and foul up the seabirds and the sea life. Not good stuff. I spoke to Rob Carter. He's a marine biologist. I said, coral bleaching really happening? He said, yes, it is. He said, but, we haven't been looking at it long enough. We don't know what the effects of the flood were. It's tricky. He said, but increased ocean temperatures will cause coral bleaching. So there are things we should be concerned about. I don't want to lose the Barrier Reef. We're going to lose out on all those millions of dollars of American tourists coming in. But I mentioned, for example, that Australia was a target. We've got a big country. It's as big as the United States. We've only got 23 million people living there. But they say, per head of population, they, produce too much CO2. 23 million people producing too much CO2. Surely it shouldn't be about how much we produce per individual in our countries, but if we're really concerned about the global environment, it should be the biggest global polluters. And which country do you think that is? Don't see anybody knocking on the Chinese embassy doors, do you? In fact, they've been given a free pass until 2050. For example, in China, had nearly 1,000 gigawatts, and I'm not blaming the Chinese for this. Don't think that. That's not the case at all. Okay? I'm talking about the movement, if they're consistent, should, treat people and all countries fairly. China had nearly 1,000 gigawatts of coal-fired electricity in 2018, 1,000 gigawatts compared to 261 gigawatts for the USA and just 36 gigawatts for Australia. But under the Paris Accord, hundreds of new coal-fired power stations are due to be built in China, India, etc. So if they're really concerned about CO2 polluting the planet, you've got to really look at the biggest polluters, surely. I mean, that just makes sense. Not target countries that are the smallest. Australia, by the way, is obviously a pretty wealthy country. So while many people have genuine environmental concerns, these activist leaders want to target Western economies. So yes, it has been politicized, and that's just a fact that we're going to have to live with. I'm not even sure whether we can do anything about it. I think the gate's open. The horse has got more than his nose out. He's on a full gallop now. But this man, his name is Dr. Tim Flannery, well known in Australia, an evolutionary mammologist who headed up the Australian government's climate change unit. He predicted that even the rain that would fall would not fill the reservoirs. I tell you, there have been massive floods in Australia over the last few years. Ironically, every climate change or every significant weather event gets blamed on climate change now. Heat, cold, whatever. So they said, for example, those 2019 bushfires, and I mention those because we saw them on TV here, were unprecedented and attributed them to climate change. They were not unprecedented. I've lived in Australia through worse bushfires than we had back then. In 1938-39, over 80 lives were lost, compared to 34 recently. 5 million hectares burnt recently, compared to 117 million hectares in those earlier bushfires. We're going to see the most relevant foul predictions of the climate alarmists are those regarding global temperatures rising from their climate models. In 1989, the UN said, 1989, entire nations will be wiped out by the year 2000 if sea levels rise and are not stopped. Failed hypothesis. A 2018 survey of 30 Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean atolls including 709 islands, showed there was no land lost at all. Can you see, as we go along though, and you'll get the point of all this at the end, the scary language, the panic. And of course, you know I was going to talk about our former vice president, right? In his famous movie, An Inconvenient Truth, should rename that, but anyway, Al Gore said polar ice will be gone by the summer of 2014. Now I'm going to tell you, our planet temperatures are warming, okay? Ice at the moment seems to be a little less, but it also seems to be cyclical as well. Okay, ice has decreased, but it still measures millions of square kilometres. That's not gone at all. And President Obama's presidential report in 2009, he said most polar bears will be gone by 2050. Just in the news a few weeks ago, I read the polar bear numbers were decreasing. But actually, they number more than they did in the 1960s. So how scientific is climate science? Let me ask you, I might be able to compare this to something else, because is evolution science when we want to look at past events that we can't repeat, observe? No. Okay, when we talk back in deep time history, we can't do that with regard to the climate, but there are observable measurements we can make for the last 140 years or so. So repeatable experiments cannot be done. As I said earlier, science cannot prove theories to be true, only that they are false. Correlation does not mean causation. So, for example, CO2 is increasing, temperatures are increasing, therefore the corollary is CO2 is causing warming. We're going to have a look at that. Okay? Science is often captured by a ruling paradigm. Well, you do not have to tell Creation Ministries International that. Peer review, sadly, this has become an epidemic, not just in this area, but within the creation evolution debate of bad science, fraudulent data being produced, human beings, funding, tenure. And I'm going to talk about the famous episode of ClimateGate that happened in the UK. So some facts. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased since 1860, and this is where it gets technical, from about 285 parts per million, okay, to 410 parts per million in 2020. So that looks like a significant increase. That accounts for about a 50% rise in 160 years. Current rate of increase is about 2 parts per million per year. That's really not disputable. Okay, so let's get that straight. The planet has been warmed by maybe 0.8 of a degree Celsius. That's the proper language you need to speak in. Since 1880, and half of this warming occurred before there was any significant change in carbon dioxide levels. That is, part of the warming, when we look at the past, could not be due to human activity. It occurred before we started the Industrial Revolution and burnt fossil fuels. GHG, I'm going to use that abbreviation, means greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are required, they are necessary. The Earth would be minus 91.4 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 33 degrees centigrade lower if we did not have greenhouse gases to help warm the Earth. But the most abundant greenhouse gas is actually water vapor, not carbon dioxide. Only about 3.3% of all those atmospheric greenhouse gases is due to carbon dioxide. Okay, so many discussions of climate change, and this is important, have excluded the effects of water vapor, the major greenhouse gas on our planet. And there are other significant greenhouse gases, of course. There's methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons, and of course we know cows produce a lot of methane, etc. I mean, that's going to be the next target. You Texans here. I said the other day, I did ministry in Texas, and it's true what they say. I could not believe how much meat you guys eat. Anyway. So here's some data. So this red line here, okay, are levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see back here, look, in the 1860s, 1870, there was a spike, it declined. 1900s, there was a spike, it declined. And now, yes, it is increasing. And this is the human emissions of carbon dioxide. So there does seem to be a correlation there, and this is, of course, what they're panicking about. But what they're doing is ignoring this. Okay? So temperature rises are not necessarily consistent with human-generated carbon dioxide. That's one of the problems. Okay? The rate of increase in temperature between 1860 on the line, the way it climbs is similar to the recent rise. But yet the amount of human-generated carbon dioxide is 60 times greater at the moment. And here's where the part I didn't really like. So, famous author Michael Crichton, I think he was the one that wrote Jurassic Park and so on, he says consensus is the business of politics. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus. So skeptical science magazines, the skeptics, our friends, which exists now to promote the public acceptance of AGW, anthropogenic global warming, published this claim. 97% of scientists agree. Most scientists believe in evolution too. This was apparently based on over 12,000 research articles, they said. An independent analysis of the same papers showed that the claim was actually grossly dishonest because only 0.5% of the articles said that warming was caused by human-made anthropogenic CO2. 500 papers were published in 2016 in peer-reviewed science journals that seriously questioned the supposed consensus on climate change. We don't get to hear this in the media, do we? As I said, they don't often report it. There are many high-profile atmospheric scientists who are skeptical of these alarmist claims. I have a list of 10 here around the world, from Germany, Huntsville, Alabama, even a scientist in NASA, and I could just read them out, but the list will be boring. But take my word, there is a significant number of scientists publishing data, and I'm only giving you a short version of it, that do not believe that there's a correlation between increased CO2 and warming. In the USA alone, the Global Warming Petition Project garnered the signatures, of some 31,500 scientists in the USA alone, 9,000 of them with PhDs who disputed the claim that CO2 would cause serious problems. The global network of 500 prominent climate scientists, 2019, stated there is no climate emergency. They invited the UN to organise with them a constructive high-level meeting between world-class scientists on both sides of the climate debate in early 2020. It didn't happen. So we talk about experimental science versus operational science. Experimental science does not use equations, to prove or falsify a hypothesis. The UN's IPCC, remember them, they're the ones that advise the governments around the world, said that the climate system is a coupled, non-linear, chaotic system, and therefore long-term prediction of future climates is not possible. But then they went ahead and used 100 mathematical models to predict the future climate. And it's very, very hard to understand. That's not the same type of science as, E equals mc squared, as we said. And again, I repeat, a major test of any scientific mathematical model is the accuracy of its predictions. So let's look at the IPCC's data. So what you're looking at here, the red and blue lines, are actual recorded satellite temperatures. The line above, all those lines above there, all of those, that's the 100 models. That's the average of those 100 models. Notice they fall in their temperature predictions well above the actual data. So their models have proven to be wrong. Their predictions wrong on data we can test and observe. But can you understand when you see that, why there is panic? When they're advising our governments that something needs to be done, and our governments will generally rely upon what the scientists are saying. So maybe we should be a little sympathetic towards our governments, because maybe they're trying to save the people and think they're genuinely saving the planet. There's a radical thought for you. But maybe they're just getting bad data. Here's another one. Do I have to go through these technical terms? Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, CMIP6. The black lines here represent sea surface temperatures. And again, here are the 68 modeled simulations, okay? And they all over-predict sea temperature levels. Another technical term, the Equilibrium Climate Sensitivity Project, the ECS, is supposed to measure the amount of warming expected from a doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How much will the temperature rise if carbon dioxide doubles? We've already seen that causation and correlation have been shown to be inconsequential. Their models range from a 1 to 4 degree increase. Now, if it's 4, I suggest to you that would be a significant problem, okay? And so we need to, again, be sober when we look at the data. If the atmospheric concentration rose to the unthinkably high level of, say, 1,000 parts per million, right, currently in the 400s, what they've showed is the first 200 parts per million contribute to about 70% of the warming effect. The other 800 parts per million have a much less effect, have a lesser effect in their models. So the 300 to 400 contribute only about 6% of that total figure. The diminishing effect is actually pretty generally agreed upon amongst climate scientists, but it was omitted from the IPCC summary provided for government policymakers. You know, in the past, you've probably heard of the medieval warming period we had. It's interesting, life prospered when the planet was warmer. Do you think it prospered during the Little Ice Age? Of course not. Can't grow nice crops in freezing cold climates, can you? Crops failed and poverty ensued. So here's something called positive feedback. This is known as amplification. So if CO2 warms the planet, it should warm the oceans. We'll get evaporation. Water vapor is the most abundant greenhouse gas, and that'll cause an amplification effect, right? It'll keep heat in, radiation can't escape out into the atmosphere, so the heat becomes trapped. It amplifies as a result of what happened. So will the increased direct warming, or the warming effect of increased CO2, be amplified by this? Okay, as I said, water is the most abundant GHG. Dr. David Evans from the Australian Federal Government's Greenhouse Office, now called the Department of Climate Change, okay, from 1999 to 2005, and he's now part-time, or was part-time till 2010. He's got 6 earned degrees related to mathematical modelling, including a PhD from Stanford. He tested the predictions of the climate models. On the 4 tests I'm about to show you, the 4 sets of data, he resigned his position because he could not be part of the scaremongering, in his words. He used NASA global satellites to measure air temperatures. Listen to this, over 3,000 buoys, that's how you should say it, that constantly patrol the oceans of the world, measuring the temperature profile. Weather balloons, they help to measure the mid-atmospheric temperatures. And of course, again, we can use satellites to measure outgoing radiation from the Earth, etc. You might remember this man, Dr. James Hansen, and he's the father of what we call the global warming movement. He presented temperature predictions to US Congress in 1988. His model predicted consistently and considerably higher air temperatures than revealed by subsequent data from NASA's satellite. It showed little change over that 18 years, even though CO2 increased in that period. He's from Columbia University. So even where a radical reduction in CO2 emissions was assumed during their models, with no increase in atmospheric CO2 after the year 2000, the models again exceeded, because they put in a prediction about them being lowered, but they still managed to show somehow that temperatures were going to increase. So remember that model? Okay, you saw that earlier where the IPCC overestimated the temperatures. So let's look at some of the others. That was the satellite data, right? So here are the buoys. Okay, the black line is the actual, the red line is the climate model. So I always find it interesting. I mean, maybe that's an average and maybe I misunderstand it, but it significantly shoots up and doesn't allow for any fluctuations in there, etc. Mid-atmosphere temperatures as measured by weather balloons, you can see, again, the predictions, and here are the actual observations over a considerable period of time. This is why we are doing this, because we feel there is enough data now. So there has been increased, to try to understand this, not decreased outgoing radiation. There is no amplification, there's no positive feedback, okay? It is escaping. It's not being trapped in the earth. So the results imply that the models are exaggerating climate sensitivity. So there you go. There's the test. Air temperatures overestimated. Okay. Ocean temperatures overestimated. The atmospheric mid-hotspot overestimated. Outgoing radiation was the opposite to what they thought. Here's the infamous hockey stick graph. Michael Mann from Penn State University, one of the linchpins this graph for causing some of the panic we see today. The IPCC used the graph in the summary for policymakers in a report they delivered to governments in 2001. Very influential. The graph was reported and exposed as being outright fraudulent. It erased the medieval warming period from the temperature record. He was criticized. Mann publicly sued a critic. So much for peer review. And then refused to pay the court-ordered costs. So unfortunately, I have to say that's kind of how corrupt that it's come to. Tony Heller, environmentalist. He's got a BS in geology from Arizona, degrees as long as my arm, and he said there is overwhelming evidence of fraud in NOAA and NASA's handling of climate data. It's very important they're held to account. Both of these people are publicly funded agencies. Being a space junkie, I had an article years ago where politicians said NASA's funding must match public interest. Same thing. CO2 is plant food. Some of our deserts are actually greening. And I suggest to you that the countries that have best cared for the environment are those that are wealthy. Neglect of other environmental matters, as I said, microplastics. You know, what's amazing, UK coal-fired power stations are being converted to run on wood. That seems to be leading us in the wrong direction, doesn't it? I mean, next they'll be saying don't cut down the trees, obviously. In Southeast Asia, massive forests have been cleared. I've seen them flying over Malaysia, massive areas converted to palms to grow palm oil, etc. So forests are being destroyed for that. But here's something encouraging. A long-term climate change activist, Michael Shellenberger, changed his mind in this book, Apocalypse Never. He said, by the way, just a bit about him, he helped formulate President Obama's energy policy, etc. at the time. He now apologizes, and his words were, for his role in the fear campaign, especially children. Climate change is happening, but there is no crisis. Look what he said. Negativity has triumphed over positivity in place of love, forgiveness, kindness, and the kingdom of heaven. Today's apocalyptic environmentalism offers fear, anger, and the narrow prospects of avoiding extinction. The bottom line is that we do not have to take any drastic action to limit warming due to human-generated CO2. I mean, if we can come up with sustainable, cost-effective, environmentally friendly ways to heat our home and run our car, I don't have a problem with that. But not at the expense of human suffering and allowing people in third world countries who need to grow their economies, right, to be able to feed their poor, etc. And they rely, obviously, heavily at the moment on fossil fuels. This shouldn't surprise us. The politicization of climate science has led to corruption of the science. The science is not settled. If one model fails the predictions, it's falsified. Positive feedback, that is that amplification effect of warming the oceans are being trapped due to increased water vapor, does not actually operate. And the estimated increase from that doubling of carbon dioxide is likely to be less than 1%. No, certainly no more than 1.5, which is why we have time. Remember I said 4 would be a problem. The impact of global warming on natural disasters, and here I have to be frank, has been completely hyped. Every significant weather event is based on climate change, not supported by the evidence. There is no climate emergency. I would say to you that there needs to be some concern for the long term. The economic impact of radical policies to limit carbon dioxide will hurt the poor most, developing countries, because wealthy countries will not. How do the poorer countries benefit by making us poor? They won't. And there are real environmental matters that we should be concerned about. Pollution, microplastics, overfishing. You could draw a list. We need to have a balanced stewardship approach. The UN recognizes the role, believe it or not, they have stated, of fossil fuels in economic prosperity. There are lots of vested interests in carbon credits. And I suggest to you as Christians, we don't do any good by going up to anybody saying, oh, it's all a hoax. Not going to listen to you. And it's going to be very, very hard to talk through kind of some of that data that I mentioned to you. We shouldn't be completely dismissive of environmental concerns. Studious, discerning, apply biblical reasoning in all that we do. But we do need to recognize God put humans in charge of this planet, and stewardship should reflect our love of God and what He's given us. There's nothing wrong in preserving nature. Don't conflate the two, okay? As we'd say, throw out the baby with the bathwater. But the earth was given for mankind's benefit. And the reason I decided to go ahead with this talk, because the thing that really grieves me the most, and hopefully you've had a sense that I have concerns for those who are marginalized, look at the church as a bunch of hypocrites where we don't exhibit love, but instead we focus on other issues and get angry. And I mentioned the other night about the greatest commandment. I hope that when we all leave here, that will be the take-home message from all of this. We've got all this information, but it's no good if we do not love others. But my major concern, children demonstrating, using 16-year-old children to sit on platforms to address our government. You know, with everything I've said, what we always need to do, ladies and gentlemen, I believe, is put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. Because you know what? I'm not the most important person. And do you mind me saying that you're not as well? Your neighbor is. And when you see children turned into political activists, why? What message are we giving them? They are looking at their elders and saying, we can't trust you. That's what their fear is. That's my real concern. You know, Scott mentioned the other night, and I wrote a newsletter about climate change a while ago, Romans 1. For what can be shown about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to him. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived since creation of the world. And it goes on, says they're without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. They became futile in their thinking. Their foolish hearts were darkened. That's, I'm afraid, our climate change scientists, I have to say, who advise our governments. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds and animals and creeping, to elevating nature above man. And when Scott Mackey's talked the other night, isn't it interesting when people worship nature, what does the scripture say that often follows? Sexual immorality. They exchange the truth of God for a lie, worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Women exchanged natural relations for those contrary to nature. Men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, and so on. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a debased mind to do what not ought to be done. Our children are being led astray in so many areas, and so much of it is to instill in them, I would suggest to you, a rebellion of the natural authority, their parents, their elders, people with experience that we've got, that we know have lived a life and we understand what it's like, and we have wisdom to show. But no, we tell a 16-year-old, you know better than your parents. That's where my heart grieves. With so many issues that we're facing today. Jesus said, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he was thrown into the sea. That's a pretty serious warning. And my brothers and sisters, I've shown you some pretty negative stuff tonight, but I'm going to say to you again, there's one way to change our world, that's it. Okay? All these things are important, but it's to reach others. You're all going home with books of information. You know, Erin held up a 10-pack of Creation magazines. We've got 597 people attending here. If everybody took a 10-pack and put one magazine in every dentist surgery, doctor's office, delicatessen, boy, do you think that just somewhere, someone picking up that magazine, that would make a difference in their lives? I can tell you it does. You know why? 30 years I've been in the ministry, we get more testimonies from the Creation magazine than any other single resource we produce. You know why? It's a glossy mag. People pick it up. Yeah, I'll read that. It's disarming. And they get the other side of the story. They get the truth about the Creator, and they realize they've been lied to. And I'll leave with that. But even that just shows you once again, ladies and gentlemen, Jesus is the answer. He's the answer.